Analyzing things for this series of vlog posts has been really helpful for me as I think through afresh how and why I do what I do. But it's also reminded me that things don't always fall into place just as quickly and easily as I would like. And sometimes I need to revisit work I've done earlier and make some changes. That became really apparent when I began to write out my sermon on 1 John 1, 1 to 4 for the first time. And more of that in just a moment. But I want to explain first why I have ended up revisiting and rewriting my carefully crafted sermon main theme that I explained in the last vlog post. You may remember this is what I came up with after some considerable reflection and work. Our fellowship with God is founded on the first-hand testimony of the first disciples who knew Jesus. And you may remember that I also said that I might well use the four F words there: fellowship, founded, first-hand, first, as a structural basis and outline for my sermon, so embedding my main theme in my sermon. But when I began to write out the developing content of my sermon, I decided that although the statement, I believe, accurately reflected the burden of the passage, it was more of an exegetical proposition than a homiletical one. Let me explain. Whenever possible, and I can't say I always achieve this, I want my sermon to be as prescriptive and directive as possible, and not merely descriptive. Commentaries, for example, are descriptive, but sermons should be prescriptive and descriptive, by which I mean they should be full of application and pressing home the truths of Scripture to the hearers. It's one of the major differences, for example, between a lecture and a sermon. And as part of that goal, I want my sermon points, my structure, to be prescriptive rather than descriptive. And the four words that I crafted and the whole MTH statement was very descriptive. So I changed things. And here is my new main theme statement for my sermon on those first four verses of 1 John. We can be certain about our fellowship with God because we have received and believed the eyewitness testimony of the apostles who knew Christ. Now, I'm hoping that you can see the change in emphasis. I'm stating the same truth as before, but in a different way, a way that I believe is more faithful to John's intention throughout the letter, which is to give his readers certainty. I'm not just stating facts, though they are facts. I'm trying to state them in such a way so as people can get hold of them, embrace them, personalize and internalize them. Remember again that application is not only about what I should do or should not do. Application is also about what I should believe and feel and affirm. And from this MTH proposition, I can now draw three main points for my sermon, which are as follows. We can be certain about Christ's identity. Number two, because we can be certain about the apostles' testimony. Therefore, number three, we can be certain about our fellowship with God. Now, I'm going to break the first one of those down into two subpoints. About Christ's identity, Jesus is fully divine and Jesus is fully human, because those truths go to the very heart of John's argument. So my 3 points argue the case for my MTH statement by working backwards. So I will in some way stress that propositional statement at the beginning and the end of my sermon, and then I'll drive home my 3 main points several times within the sermon itself. So I now have the bones, the structure, the outline of my sermon. Now let me just mention here that sometimes, in my experience, my structure comes first, and then I write out the first draft of the content of the sermon, filling in the structure outline, as it were. But sometimes as I actually begin to write out the sermon content, the structure becomes clear. And that's really what happened in this particular case. I'd begun to write out my sermon material, and that's when I realized that I need to make the changes I mentioned before. And also, as I did that, the structure itself became clearer. So now I have the bones of my sermon, and now I need to put the flesh of the sermon on the bones. So I'm continuing this analogy of the body, which I explained in a previous vlog post. The flesh of the text is what we see with our eyes, and beneath that is the skeleton of the text. Now I'm reversing that process and working from the inside out, building the skeleton and then clothing it with flesh. The flesh is what my listeners will hear when I preach the sermon. So now I set about actually working on the first draft of the script of my sermon. And what I do, and have just done actually, is write out what I plan to say in full, word for word. Now, I'll be honest with you, I find this part of the process quite tiresome, but I have learned over the years just how valuable and important it is. It's certainly not the finished article, but what I do is I just pour onto the page all that I've been kicking around in my head and in written notes for some time, and then that gives me something on paper that I can rework and shape and tidy up over the next few days. What is missing in this first draft are good illustrations, what I call the eyes of my sermon, and also the introduction and a conclusion. Now, the reason for that is I always leave my conclusion and introduction to the very end. And then I work on them when I am certain as to exactly what needs concluding and what needs introducing. Sometimes illustrations come thick and fast, even as I'm writing my first draft, and I'll throw them in. But then when I rework my sermon, and here is another good reason for writing it out in detail, I can then see where an illustration is needed or an illustration is not strong enough or whatever the case may be. And I have to admit that on this occasion, I haven't yet come up with any illustrations. And that is something I need to work on in the next stage of preparing to preach. Now, there's one more element of my sermon, a vital element, that is somewhat lacking at the moment. The arms and legs, the application of my sermon. But that's another issue altogether. And God willing, I'll deal with that in my next vlog post in this series.